Hello, I'm Gwen Hill, Pine Ridge Baptist Church, Sunday School Department, Ladies Sunday School class. Welcome to join us this morning as we study Exodus chapter 7. And we are looking at Moses and Aaron getting a pep talk from God. They have went to see the Pharaoh for their very first face-to-face meeting, and it didn't go well. They asked for Pharaoh to release the people to go 3 days into the wilderness to worship God, and he said no. He was so offended by that and so convinced that he was not going to ever let them go that he increased their workload, and things were getting really bad. The Hebrew children, instead of going to God in prayer and saying, look what's happened to us, going to Moses even, they went straight back to Pharaoh and tried to entreat with him to change his edict, and he would not. So then they met with Moses and Aaron and showered them with disappointment, their complaints about things getting worse since they got there, and what were they trying to do anyway? Make their lives even worse? Hard to believe that you get much worse than being someone's slave, but they felt like it was. Moses was just heartsick, and he went off to talk to God. What we're starting out in chapter 7 is God and Moses talking. God is now talking back to Moses, answering some of the questions that Moses had asked, and bolstering Moses' and encouraging him. Verse 1, 2, and 3. So the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you as a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron, your brother, shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron, your brother, shall speak to Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of his land. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. God is telling Moses, my plan hasn't changed, Moses. You're still the man I've chosen. You still have a job to do. I will still overcome Pharaoh. It's just not going to be as fast as you think it was going to be. But he will. He's got a hard heart, an unyielding heart. And I will harden it even harder so that I can do my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Why would God want to do signs and wonders in the lands of Egypt? These people had been 400 years under the control of Egypt. They really have lost sight of the God of Jacob, the God of Joseph, Isaac, and Abraham. They know him, but they don't know him. So he's introducing himself not only to Pharaoh, but to his people. He's not only introducing himself as the powerful God that he is, but as the loving and protecting God he is. But you've got to wade high water here before we can get to that and see that. In verse 4 and 5, he continues talking to Moses, and he said, Pharaoh's not going to heed you, but so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies and my people, my children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. He says, not only am I witnessing of myself to Pharaoh, I'm also witnessing of myself to you, to the children, the Hebrew children, and also for the Egyptians who are around. I want everyone to know I am the God of Israel. He's witnessing of himself. Now, he knew something about that was going to happen about good old Pharaoh, and he knew that it was probably mid-July to middle of August, and that's the time traditionally when the Nile River overflows its banks. That is the time that they worship the Nile the most. The Nile was considered a god in Egypt, a big G god to them. It was the sustainer and giver of life in Egypt, is what they thought. So every year, at about that time, they had big festivals to celebrate, to worship the god of the Nile. So this would be the logical time for God to say, nope, it's time for me to show you that I am mightier than any Nile River. So in verse 6, 7, 8, and 9, then Moses and Aaron did just like God said. So the Lord commanded them, so they did. Moses was 80, Aaron was 83, and they spoke to Pharaoh. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, show a miracle for yourselves, then you're going to say to Aaron, take up your rod and cast it before Pharaoh and let it become a serpent. I love this. The picture that I have is of those two men dressed like shepherds walking into the Pharaoh's palace, both of them having their staffs in their hands, and God was right there whispering in Moses' ear. He's not leaving him alone. He's going right with him. He'll do that with us too. He'll walk right beside you. Verse 10, 11, and 12. So Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh, and they did just as the Lord commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. But Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians of Egypt. And they also did in like manner with their enchantments. For every man threw down his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. Before this study, I didn't really notice the plural use of these words. The wise men, the sorcerers, and the magicians. So that means there was at least 6. That would have been 6 snakes against 1. No big deal. God's rod turns into God's snake, which swallows them all up. Our God, what a magnificent God. Can you see the looks on their faces? The magicians, they don't have a rod now. But Pharaoh's heart, his mind, grew hard, and he did not heed them, as the Lord had said. I want you to notice the Pharaoh hardened his own heart, not the Lord. Okay? So the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard, unyielding, and he refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning when he goes out to the water, and you shall stand at the river's bank and meet him, and the rod which was turned to a serpent you shall take in your hand. We're fixing to talk about the first plague. In verse 16, 17, and 18. And you shall say to him, this is Aaron is going to be talking to Pharaoh. And this is what God is telling him to say. And you shall say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But indeed, until now you would not hear. Thus saith the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I'll strike the waters which are in the river with the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that are in the river will die, the river will stink, and the Egyptians will loathe to drink the water of the river. Remember, they're there to worship the Nile. The Nile is their source of life. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. Say to Aaron, take your rod and stretch it out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their streams, over their rivers, over their ponds, and over their pools of water, that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in the buckets of wood and in the pitchers of stone. And Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded. So he lifted up the rod, and he struck the water that was in the river, in the sight of the Pharaoh, in the sight of his servants. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the river stank, didn't it? What happened to the fish? They didn't have any water to breathe. They can't get oxygen from the blood, so they died. Verses 21 and 22. The fish that were in the river died. The river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water of the river. So there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments. They mimicked the act. And Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them as the Lord had said. There they would have been singing their song, and one of the songs that they sang went something like this. I'm not going to sing it, just going to say it. I'm having a hard enough time to keep from coughing. Hail to thee, O Nile, that issues from the earth and comes to keep Egypt alive. Right in the middle of that would have turned to blood. Yes, blood is the sign of life, but not for a river. It was amazing. Said it filled up the buckets of wood and the vases of stone. That speaks to the house. That speaks to the animal care. That speaks that if I was making something that required water mixed with it that morning, pour it up, and what came out was not expected water but blood. Maybe going to pour one of the kids a cup of water, wouldn't have been water that came out. Or if I was going to water my animals, it wouldn't be water that came out. Old blood stinks. Has a very peculiar, yucky, acid, acrid kind of smell. And old fish is awful. And this whole river, the whole Nile, and all of the ponds and the tributaries, they all were blood and they all stank. Can you imagine what that land was like? Pharaoh just went off home to sulk. Verses 23, 24, and 25. And Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither was his heart moved by this. So all the Egyptians dug all around the river for water to drink, because they could not drink the water from the river. And 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the river. 7 days without water. How would that influence your life even today, to be without water for 7 days? Without any form of liquid, a human will die after 72 hours. So I can imagine after 36 hours, they were having some dire circumstances. They were digging, trying to make shallow wells, hoping that would filtrate the water. They don't usually do that because that water was contaminated, usually thought to be contaminated. But they're doing it now. Okay, I'm going to try to do chapter 8. You notice every time the magicians try to do something that it just gets worse? They could show their real power by ending what God had done. God turned the water into blood. They could show real power by turning it back into the Nile River. But they can't. They can imitate what God does. Satan can imitate what God does. But he can't be the source. Let's go to Exodus, the 8th chapter. Ooh, plague number 2 is fixing to start. And that's the plague of frogs. And the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all your territory with frogs. So the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into your house, into your bedroom, onto your bed, into your houses of your servants, onto your people, into your ovens, and into your kneading bowls. And the frogs shall come up on you, and on your people, and on your servants." Well, they had around 120 named gods, and one of them that they had was a god that had the body of a female human, but the head of a frog. And her name was Heget, Heget, the goddess Heget. Got a little picture over here. Isn't she adorable? Isn't she something that you would really want to worship? Well, they revered the frogs. The frogs ate all kinds of mosquitoes and insects, and was a wonderful benefit to the country. And frogs staying where frogs should be would be a good thing, and they revered them. They even had a law that it was against the law to kill a frog. What's the life expectancy of a frog? Depending on the species, anywhere from 3 years to 20 years. In verse 5, 6, and 7 of verse 8, an army of frogs comes up from the river. Pharaoh shook his head. God whispered Pharaoh's answer into Moses because he didn't believe that this was fixing to come about, but it did. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your rod over the streams, over the rivers, over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the water of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments and brought up frogs on the land of Egypt. Ain't going to make a bad problem worse? Why would they do that? If they were capable of doing wonderful magic tricks, take the frogs away. Don't add to them. But that's the way they did. They made the problem worse every step they made. Speaking of steps, they covered the whole land of Egypt. What if you got up early in the morning and you're going to the kitchen and you stepped on a frog, and then you took another step, you had to shuffle, prod the frogs away as you walked? I don't know about you, but I wouldn't enjoy that. I know they wore sandals, but what if you went to put your sandals on and you had to get the frogs out first? They were sitting there in amongst the straps. Come into bed at night and there was something cold and slippery in your bed, and no, it's not your spouse's feet. What about if you woke up in the morning and there was a big bullfrog looking you right in the face sitting on your pillow? What if you wanted to cook food for your family and you got the flour in your kneading bowl and you turned around to get some liquid and you turn back and there's a big frog sitting in your kneading bowl? And about the noise. Frogs are loud. What about the croaking and the carrying on of these frogs? Well, Pharaoh gets frog tired. Let's look at 8, 9, 10, and 11. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord. That's a big admission. He's admitted now that there is a Lord, that he is the control over the frogs, and that the Lord wants him to do something. He's agreed to do it. In verse 9, and Moses said to Pharaoh, well, accept the honor of saying when I shall intercede for you, for your servants, and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you and from your house, that they may remain in the river only. How kind and generous of Moses to allow Pharaoh to set the day and time for the frogs to leave. What would you say? When would you say, Moses, I need you to get rid of those frogs? If it was Gwen Hill, I would say now. But what did Pharaoh say in verse 10? So he, Pharaoh, said, tomorrow. And he, Moses, said, let it be according to your word, that they may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. And the frogs shall depart from you, from your houses, from your servants, and from your people. They shall remain in the river only. Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried out to the Lord concerning the frogs, which he had brought against Pharaoh. So the Lord did according to the word of Moses, And the frogs died out of the houses, out of the courtyards, and out of the fields. And they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. You know, why did Pharaoh say tomorrow? Pharaoh knew he had transgressed the Lord. And he still was hoping beyond hope that something in nature would take care of this problem before he had to have the Lord do something. You know, if you ever had a problem, remember Scarlett O'Hara? And she would be faced with a problem. She said, I'll think of that tomorrow. I'll face that tomorrow. How many times have you seen someone who is a smoker who said, I can quit anytime I want to. I think I might start tomorrow. A dieter who says, I start my diet on Monday, or I start my diet tomorrow. We tend to put off just for a little while longer and hold on to the sins that we enjoy. Not you, though, I'm sure. And in verse 15, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not heed them, as the Lord had said. He hardened his heart, not God. If you loosely clasp your fist, think of this as Pharaoh's brain. Pharaoh's brain is clenched. He's stubborn. And he says no. Okay? And he has a really hard time changing his mind. But there's nothing to prevent him from softening. When he sees what the God is doing, when he sees how God is giving him the opportunity to even set the date and time, he could have softened his heart. He could have softened his mind. He could have become yielding, but he didn't. He hardened, kept it hardened. When we get over to like plague 6, I think it is, it says the Lord hardened his heart. When the Lord hardens your heart, it's like he gives you opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. And if you keep your mind closed and you stay stubborn and you don't listen to him or you don't obey him, after so long, he's tired. He don't want to put up with a disobedient child any longer. So then he hardens your heart. So you cannot relax your heart and become soft and pliable without much effort. And you're not going to do that. And he knows it. That's what it's meant when it says the Lord hardened his heart. Pharaoh has to harden first and has to go through all kinds of options where he keeps his mind hardened. And then God is over it, tired of it. He does the same thing to you and I. When God asks you to do something, he will equip you to do it. But first you step out in faith, and then he will equip you. If you don't do what he asks you to do, if you don't listen, if you don't grow, if you don't learn, eventually God says, I'll go to someone else because I'm wasting my time with them. They're never going to change their mind. Don't be like Pharaoh. Hard-hearted. He was obstinate. He brought about his own fatal doom. And this is how sin becomes its own punishment. The third plague is beginning to start, and it's the plague of lice. Depending on what translation you use, it could say lice or it could say gnats. The word in Hebrew can mean either one. Coming from the dust. We've seen him attack the river. We've seen him attack like with the frogs and the blood. And now we're seeing him go into the earth itself, to the dust of the earth. So the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your rod and strike the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, and he struck the dust of the earth, and it became lice on man and on beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Now the magicians so worked with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they couldn't do it. So there were lice on man and on beast, and you might well say on magician and on Pharaoh. Then the magicians went to Pharaoh, and they told Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had said. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Rise early before Pharaoh and stand before Pharaoh as he comes out to the water. Then say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me. Or else, if you do not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and on your servants, on your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they stand.'" Let's go back to the gnats for just a second. I hate gnats. I've been very fortunate in my life. I've never had lice. And as a nurse, I have trembled in fear sometimes when I take care of people with lice. Afraid I would catch them. They are so distracting. You can't think of anything but those gnats and those lice. They itch and they get everywhere. And then the gnats fly in your eyes and they fly up your nose and in your ears. And you can't talk. They're right there with them, the swarms of them. Horrible existence that they had. And the Lord said, and the Lord sent that plague on them without even telling them it was coming. The Lord does not have to announce everything that he does. And he didn't this time. But now the next one he does. The magicians went to Pharaoh and they said, "This is like the finger of God." Some translations, the commentaries say the magicians downplayed it as saying, "This is just a finger of God. Don't worry about it. It'll go away." Other commentaries say, "This is the finger of God." It's like an alarm. You need to pay attention, Pharaoh. Things are bad. I don't know which way it was. But I know he didn't pay attention to them. So now we're having the plague of the flies. Oh my. Now he's attacking the air. The water, the land, and the air. When God has war with someone, he has a big war with someone, doesn't he? "And in that day I will set apart the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may know that I am the God, the Lord, in the midst of the land. I will make a difference between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall be." He said, "Going to send flies. I'm going to send them tomorrow. And so that you know that what I'm telling you is true, and so that you know that it's from me, I'm going to exempt the land of Goshen." They've had the blood in the water. They've had the frogs, but they're not going to have the flies. But you will. In verse 24, and the Lord said, thick swarms of flies came into the house of Pharaoh, into his servants' houses, and into all the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted because of the swarm of flies. But there was nothing in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh wonders about that. In verse 25, then Pharaoh called to Moses and Aaron. He said, "Go, sacrifice your God to your God in the land." He wants a compromise. Don't go out in the wilderness. You can sacrifice right where you're at. Stay at home. You can do it right there. And Moses said, "It is not right to do so, for we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. If we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, then will they not stone us?" The Egyptians thought shepherds were an abomination, and they did not believe in lambs for sacrifice, and that's what the Israelis were needing to do. And the penalty for worshiping other than Egypt's gods was death by stoning. They had escaped this all the time. They lived in Goshen under Joseph. They escaped because God protected Goshen. But now, Moses is saying, we can't do this in Goshen. They'll want to kill us. No. Moses continues in verse 27. He says, we'll go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, and we'll sacrifice to the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. And Pharaoh said, I'll let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you shall not go very far. And intercede for me, please. He didn't add the please, I did. Then Moses said, indeed, I am going out from you. Moses was again given a compromise. Pharaoh said, well, okay, you can go into the wilderness, but just go a little ways. Go a little ways so I can still contain you, still capture you back, so I can still see you, not too far away. You know, sometimes little sins are very dangerous. Very dangerous. And Moses said, indeed, I'm going out from you, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart tomorrow from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. But let Pharaoh not deal deceitfully anymore in not letting the people go to sacrifice the Lord. So Moses went out from Pharaoh, and he entreated the Lord. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. He removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh and from his servants and from his people. Not one remained. But Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time too. Neither would he let the people go. Moses did as requested, but Pharaoh couldn't keep his word. Oh, bad things are fixing to happen. See you next week, and we'll go into chapter 9. Have a good week.